When a wealthy man insults a taxi driver in South Africa, he has no idea the consequences will shake his world to its core. How far will Kwame's fight for dignity take him, and will David regret his actions? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. It was a warm morning in Johannesburg, South Africa, a city of contrasts where modern skyscrapers stood beside bustling street markets. The day was just beginning to unfold when two men unknowingly crossed paths, their futures destined to collide in the most unexpected of ways. David Westbrook, a wealthy, arrogant businessman from the United States, stepped off the plane and into the African heat. He had arrived in Johannesburg to close a deal for his luxury car brand, Westbrook Motors. With a reputation for not just success but domination, David had made a name for himself in the automotive world. As far as he was concerned, money was the answer to everything. And everything was about to go according to plan, until he met a man he would never forget. Kwame, a middle-aged black man, was working as a taxi driver in Johannesburg. He was no stranger to the hustle of city life. Driving a taxi wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. He had learned long ago to keep his head down and focus on the job. Today, as he waited in line for passengers at OR Tambo International Airport, he could never have imagined how this ride would change his life. David, irritated after a long flight and a string of meetings, stepped out of the airport looking for the first available taxi. He was in no mood for anything less than efficiency. "Taxi to Sandton," David said to the line of drivers, his voice clipped and demanding. Kwame, noticing that David seemed to be in a rush, stepped forward with a smile. "I can take you, sir. No worries, we'll get there fast." David nodded, dismissively glancing at him as he slid into the back seat of the taxi. He had already started scrolling through his phone, impatient to get to his hotel. Kwame started the engine, pulling out into the busy streets of Johannesburg. The radio was playing softly in the background, but the silence in the car was thick. David was too focused on his phone to engage in any conversation. Then, without warning, David broke the silence. "So, do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice dripping with superiority as he glanced in the rearview mirror. Kwame, taken aback, shook his head, his eyes still on the road. "No, sir, I don't." "I'm David Westbrook, owner of Westbrook Motors," David continued. "I run one of the biggest car companies in the world. You've probably never heard of it, but soon enough, our cars will be sold in every country. I'm the kind of person who makes things happen." Kwame nodded politely, unsure of where the conversation was going. He had dealt with plenty of people who liked to brag about their accomplishments. This wasn't new to him, but something about the way David was speaking began to rub him the wrong way. "I'm surprised you don't know who I am," David said, now visibly irritated. "But then again, people like you, well, I guess you wouldn't be exposed to the things that really matter. Your job isn't exactly high profile, is it?" Kwame, a proud man who had worked hard to get where he was, felt a twinge of discomfort. He knew he couldn't change his circumstances overnight, but he wasn't about to let anyone insult his work, especially not a stranger who seemed to think his wealth made him superior. David's tone grew harsher as he continued. "You're just a driver. You probably don't even know how to drive properly. Can't imagine what it's like to have real responsibility." Kwame bit his tongue, resisting the urge to respond. He had been in situations like this before, people who assumed that because he drove a taxi, he wasn't worthy of respect. But there was something about David's attitude that felt particularly insulting. He had no idea what Kwame had gone through to build his life. The fact that David thought he could belittle someone based solely on their occupation, their skin color, was unbearable. The ride continued, with David launching into a rant about his business empire, his wealth, and his success. He spoke like he was the center of the universe, and anyone who didn't measure up to his standards was beneath him. But Kwame remained silent. He focused on the road, trying not to let David's words get under his skin. But the more David spoke, the harder it became to ignore his arrogance. As they neared Sandton, the traffic began to slow. David glanced at his watch and tapped his fingers impatiently on the seat. You really should learn how to drive faster, David muttered, staring out of the window. Kwame could feel the insult in those words, but he was no longer interested in engaging. The anger that had built up inside him over the past few minutes was starting to boil over. He was a man who valued dignity, and today he was losing his patience. Finally, David looked in the rearview mirror one last time and sneered. You know, I don't know why I bother with people like you. You probably don't even have aspirations. You think this, driving a cab, is your destiny, don't you? Kwame's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had heard these words too many times before, but today they stung in a way they hadn't in the past. This wasn't just a random insult. This was a direct attack on his worth as a person. His patience had worn thin, and without thinking, he decided to speak his mind. "Sir," Kwame said, his voice calm but firm, "you don't know anything about me. You don't know where I've been or what I've been through, and you don't know what I'm capable of. I'm not defined by this job, just as you're not defined by your wealth." David, taken aback by the response, raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Kwame looked at him briefly before turning his eyes back to the road. "You may have money and power, but it doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just means you've had different opportunities. Don't think that because you've got riches, you can talk down to people. I'm more than just a driver. We all are." David didn't say anything for a moment. The weight of Kwame's words hung in the air, but David, too proud and too arrogant to admit any wrong, remained silent for the rest of the ride. When the car finally reached Santon, David got out without a word, his face flushed with the sting of having been spoken to like that. He threw a few bills at Kwame for the ride and slammed the door behind him. As Kwame watched him walk away, he felt a mix of frustration and determination. David Westbrook had no idea what he had just done, but he would soon learn. It had been weeks since that uncomfortable encounter between Kwame and David. Life, as it always does, moved on. Kwame continued his work as a taxi driver, picking up passengers and driving through the busy streets of Johannesburg. Though the memory of the arrogant man from the airport still lingered in his mind, he had long since put it behind him. He had too much pride to let one man's ignorance define his sense of self. Meanwhile, David Westbrook was experiencing his own set of challenges. He had come to South Africa to expand his luxury car brand, Westbrook Motors, and it seemed like everything was going according to plan. The market for high-end cars in Africa was booming, and he was about to secure a lucrative deal with one of the local car dealerships in Johannesburg. The promise of financial success and the expansion of his company's global footprint was just around the corner. But something gnawed at David, an uneasiness, a feeling that there was more to this trip than just business. One fateful afternoon, as he sat in his luxury office in Santon, David received a call that would alter the course of his life. "Mr. Westbrook, we have a situation," said the voice on the other end of the phone. It was the head of his marketing division. "There's a movement growing online. It's targeting us. It's a social media campaign that's quickly gaining traction, and, well, it's not good." David's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "It's calling for a boycott of Westbrook Motors, demanding that we address our lack of diversity. There are accusations that we have no representation of black people in our leadership or advertisements. And it's not just that. It's also targeting you personally, claiming that you've made disparaging remarks about people of different races." David felt his stomach churn. The accusation about him being racially insensitive was completely unfounded. He had always viewed himself as someone who believed in merit, who believed that everyone, regardless of race, should earn their place. But these rumors, these accusations, they were gaining momentum. He tried to dismiss it at first. "Let them talk. I've got a deal to close." But the pressure was mounting. The social media posts were relentless, and the damage to his brand was starting to show. David's mind raced. He needed to take action, but he didn't know where to start. That's when his assistant came in, holding a piece of paper. "Sir, this might help. It's a petition from one of the local taxi drivers who was affected by your incident a while ago. His name is Kwame. He's demanding that you publicly apologize for your actions. It's gaining traction." David froze. The name was familiar. It took him a moment to place it, but then it hit him like a bolt of lightning. Kwame, the man he had insulted in the taxi weeks ago. David felt a knot in his stomach. He had thought the situation had been dismissed, that it was nothing more than an uncomfortable ride. But now, this small act of defiance had turned into something much bigger. People were listening to Kwame. They were rallying behind him. And it seemed like they wouldn't stop until David faced the consequences of his arrogance. In the days that followed, David tried to reach out to Kwame, to offer an apology, to explain himself. But Kwame wasn't interested in hearing from him, not after everything that had happened. Instead, Kwame's movement grew stronger. Local news outlets picked up the story with headlines that read, "Wealth, Power, and Privilege, the Westbrook Motors Scandal," and "African Taxi Driver Leads Charge Against Racism in Business." Kwame's words had resonated with people, especially the local black community, who had long felt excluded from the higher echelons of corporate power. It wasn't just about the words David had said to Kwame anymore. It was about a larger issue of racial inequality and exclusion in industries that were overwhelmingly controlled by white men. The situation was rapidly escalating, and David was starting to feel trapped in the storm he had unknowingly created. It was then that David realized the only way out was to take full accountability, something that he had never considered before. The realization hit him hard. He couldn't just sit back and ignore the issue. He couldn't ignore the voices of people like Kwame, who had been silenced for too long. If he wanted to save his company, his reputation, and his own soul, he had to make things right. But how? David spent days in reflection. He canceled meetings, avoided phone calls, and worked tirelessly on a new strategy. When he was finally ready, he called a press conference. The cameras were rolling, the reporters were waiting, and the world was watching. Standing before the crowd, David Westbrook, the man who had once looked down on others, now stood in front of them with a sense of humility. He began speaking, and his words were clear. "I stand before you today to apologize. I made a mistake, a serious mistake. I insulted a man, a fellow human being, based on his profession, his background, and his race. And in doing so, I contributed to a system of exclusion, a system that's been alive for far too long. I have learned from this experience, and I am committed to doing better." David paused, feeling the weight of the words he had never thought he'd say. This is bigger than just me. This is about acknowledging that people deserve respect, no matter their race, their job, or their background. I am committed to making Westbrook Motors a place where everyone is given the chance to thrive, a place where diversity isn't just a token gesture but a real part of the fabric of our company. He then turned to the camera, his voice softening. "I want to thank Kwame, the man I insulted, for opening my eyes. I owe him, and I owe all of you, a better version of myself." The press conference ended, but the impact of David's words didn't stop there. Kwame's boycott and social media campaign had forced David to confront his own prejudice, his own ignorance. And now, Westbrook Motors was about to change, for the better. As David left the conference room, he knew that the road ahead would be long, but it was a road worth traveling. He had learned a valuable lesson. Wealth and power meant nothing if they came at the cost of others. Kwame had shown him that true leadership wasn't about looking down on people. It was about lifting them up. And as for Kwame, he didn't just win the battle for his dignity. He had ignited a fire that would change the corporate landscape forever.